So please make a start. Sorry, Rhonda, just unmute yourself for me. Thank you.
Bula Vinaka and warm Pacific greetings to you all. I'm actually, my name is Rhonda Robinson and I am the Deputy Director from SPC's Pacific Communities Disaster and Community Resilience Program. And I'll be stepping in for a bit to moderate this first plenary session for our Pacific Resilience meeting. And what a wonderful welcome and opening ceremony by our country counterparts in Tuvalu. We very appreciative of that gesture, that welcome, and that reminder of our theme today. Our plenary, for those of you who have connected in this morning, is self-reliance in an interconnected world. And we're very excited to have with us today 3 powerful speakers sharing 3 very different perspectives, but with common strands we will weave together over the next several minutes that we have together in this space, and indeed over the next few days, in fact. So with that, let's meet them. First of all, we're very happy to have Kathy Jetnil-Kitchener on the call with us this morning, or on this platform today, a climate envoy and director of geographic. Kathy, as many of you may already know, is a Marshall Islander poet, performance artist, and educator. And geographic is an environmentalist organization which is really dedicated to empowering our Marshallese youth to seek solutions to climate change and other environmental impacts affecting their home islands. Kathy has performed powerful poetry in our Pacific region and globally, and has been an advocate for young Pacific Islanders at the UN and in many other fora and platforms. I mean, we're really honored to have her here with us today. We're also joined by Marlene Datta, who is founder of Barter for Better Fiji. Bula Marlene has worked in business, non-government organizations, and also community development across Fiji, Kiribati, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, and Papua New Guinea. Last year, Marlene, with the support of a small and dedicated a group of friends, established Barter for Better Fiji in response to the economic and social impacts being felt by the coronavirus pandemic. Marlene is going to share Barter for Better Fiji story today with us. And third is Reverend James Bhagwan. Reverend James is the General Secretary of the Pacific Council of Churches, which brings together 32 member churches and 10 national councils of churches across our 18 Pacific Island countries and territories. He is also an ordained minister of the Methodist Hub of Fiji, preaches and celebrates the sacraments in an Anglican diocese of Polynesia, and is a passionate advocate for ecological stewardship, as some of you will know, and climate justice. So with those very brief introductions, we'd like to start our plenary session today by first giving the space to Kathy, who is going to share a poem with us and then talk to us about the work of geographic and how it builds resilience in young Marshall Islanders. Welcome to the mat, Kathy.
Hi, hello? Can you hear me? Sorry. I think
Hi,
there's
Kathy.
a little bit
Yes,
of...
we can.
Okay. Sorry, I missed that.
If you just want
our
to put your
Wi-Fi just
video
went
on
out.
for me.
Oh yeah, I'm not putting the video. Oh, here we go. I'm turning it on now.
Perfect, thank you.
Sorry, I think my Wi-Fi went out for just a second. So it just came back on. So I missed the last maybe a few minutes. Okay, so it's me sharing the poem. T? Okay, all right. I just got a confirmation from James. Okay, so I'll go ahead and launch into the poem. So this is a piece that I actually wrote in collaboration with 350 Pacific. So 350 Pacific is an organization that I think most people out here know works on climate change. And I had some friends approach me. It was leading up to the anniversary of Paris COP21 this past December. And as we all know, there was a flurry of climate activities to commemorate that moment. And so I was reflecting, you know, as someone who just moved back last year again. I've lived here on and off for a while, but as someone who moved back again and started working with our national government on our national adaptation plan, well, I'll try to slow down for our interpreter. Um, on our national adaptation plan and on working on climate change with our national government, it was new to me to start seeing all the level of work and coordination and strategy that goes into our international engagement on climate change. And so I wrote this poem to sort of, one, commemorate Tony DeBruin, who was our former climate change ambassador and former minister, who helped grandfather the Paris Treaty. That's what he was known for. To honor him and the work that he's done. He passed away a few years ago, but his legacy still lives on and his name still comes up in so many of the work that we do on climate change. And it was also to honor Pacific Islanders who are working on climate change across the region, despite how difficult, you know, the work is. So this is the piece that I wrote. I hope you all can hear me okay. It's called Midnight. The piece was also inspired by a campaign with the Climate Vulnerable Forum called Midnight to Paris. So that's why you'll see some references to Midnight too. So lots of stuff happening in the piece. So this is the piece right here. So Midnight. For Tony, we'll say, for Tony. Corals are resilient, I've been told. And so are we. We've survived worse. Just ask your elders, they'll lift their shirts, show you bunker scars, typhoon tent towns, atomic nightmares of lost, irradiated islands. So this is just another incoming tide to shore up against. Hence seawalls, hence foreign aid, hence consultants, terms of references, a framework for asking each other, which island will we move to? Which island will be hit first? Which island is worth salvaging? The wreck, a slow-moving accident, the ultimate disaster, atomic oblivion. As if we haven't experienced this before, as if we haven't been told that evacuation is safer. You'll come home someday. 2030, 2040, long-term versus short-term. We debate this around the table. We do the work, submit reports, but we are short on time. Before the clock strikes midnight, before the pumpkin rots, before our glass island shatters, are we so easily broken? Maybe we need flags to tell us how afraid we should be. We have flags for COVID threat levels. Yellow for safe, yellow for prepare, yellow for complacency, yellow worth celebrating, COVID-free. The US is celebrating, part of it anyway. They are dancing in the street and kissing babies because celebrations are worthy, because the US will be back in the Paris Treaty, because it feels like multiple breaths taken at once, like bubbles bursting through reefs. We reassemble ourselves. We gather the calcium carbonate to grow our coral skeletons into sunlight. Look, up ahead, a lush marine garden awaits. For Tony. Thank you. That's the rest of the piece. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And I know that you missed the start of that introduction. My name is Samantha Magic. I also missed the start of the introduction, as is part of our new normal. We're grappling with technology a bit, but thank you so much, Rhonda, for doing the introduction for me and introducing Kathy and that incredibly powerful piece that she just shared with us. Kathy, we actually, Rhonda actually said that she would share the poem, but then also if you could spend some time talking to us about the work of geographic and how you're building resilience in the young Marshallese Islanders, the young Marshall Islanders that are part of the organization. So if I could just welcome you back to the mat to talk about that a little.
Yeah, sure. So I'm actually calling from right outside Jojigum, our youth center. I had to come outside because it's just like a one-room office and there's no space to talk to. And there's just kids in there just talking and being kids, you know. And basically the work that we're doing is we're trying to provide just a home, a space. Jojigum literally means your home or your place in Karinamayo. And it stands for Geological, which is youth for a greener, more lush islands, loosely translated. And so what we're trying to do is just provide a space for young people who care about these issues to feel comfortable, to be a part of change, to organize, and to learn more about climate change and environmental issues. And that's usually through advocacy, media, and the arts. So that's part of my work. I'm director for Jojigum as a nonprofit, but I also work with the National Adaptation Planning as climate envoy, as I said before. So I try to find ways to incorporate what I'm doing at kind of the international and national level into the grassroots level and kind of keep the youth updated on what's happening, you know, what are the structures that we have in place, and then how do they get involved. And so they've organized a lot of cleanups and picnics. I should try to slow down, sorry. So they've organized a lot of cleanups and picnics. We also have the Climate and Health Arts Camp that's coming up in 2 weeks. It's where we teach painting, songwriting, weaving, and poetry. And it's all to high school students. And we explore the intersections between climate change and health. And so that's really discussing, you know, a space where we can talk about COVID and how it's connected to climate change, you know, dengue and how that's been connected to climate change, how that's impacted their life. And then they turn that into artwork, you know, through all of those number of mediums. And we're also trying to let them, you know, even collaborate across the fields. So for me, I think, you know, we're short-staffed. It's a small nonprofit. We're not doing huge amounts of youth work. We try to maintain our programs and manage what we can do. But I think we're trying to make sure that there is a space for our young people to be engaging on these topics meaningfully, and that they continue to engage and have that space throughout the year, even after our programs are done. So they wrote really powerful songs. One of our youth artists painted painted an astronaut on the moon doing a traditional fishing. And that his explanation was that wherever we go, our cultures follow. So for him, even if, you know, something, you know, God forbid happened to our planet, that, you know, our identities are resilient enough to make it across interplanetary spaces. So, you know, really beautiful visioning and imagining. We want to provide that space for them so that they're not just responding to a crisis constantly, but to also imagine a better future and also imagine how we respond as Marshallese people. So I think I'll stop there because I know we have a lot of places to go, but that's just a touch on what kind of work we do with our nonprofit. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. It's a great connection to some of the discussions that happened yesterday as well through the youth forum, and I know that will be carried out over the next few days. Now we're going to move to Fiji and to Marlene Dutta. As you heard earlier, Marlene is the founder of Barter for Better Fiji, which is really built on a belief of community and communal resilience, and resistance, I guess, in a way. Marlene, can you talk to us about the origins of Barter for Better Fiji and also how you're centering resilience in Fijians? Naka.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Yeah, thank you, Sam. Well, Barter for Better Fiji was, like most things, born out of necessity. I think for me, quite early on, this was in March 2020, when COVID was raging around the world. And then us in the Pacific, we hadn't really seen, well, like the numbers that we are seeing now. So it was a really uncertain time. We had just closed our borders. Thousands of people were out of jobs. And I sat down and I asked myself the question, what would happen when the money ran out? One of the answers for me was bartering. I immediately turned to a traditional or an ancient concept that I thought could be useful or practical in today's world. So barter came quickly. I researched it, found that yes, we had all the right ingredients for it to flourish. We had a people who was familiar with it. We had the platform to use to make barter easier to use, I guess, in today's world, and all the other components that would be really would make bartering a solution to what we were going through in terms of job losses and that. So that was how I came about with the concept. But with everything else, you needed to be in the right space and in the right place to be able to do something like this. So I had to grapple with my own behavior, with my own feelings of frustration and of uncertainty and of fear, where I found myself like being really unkind in spaces, trying to get people to follow what I thought was the best way to behave in terms of distancing and everything else, and to trying to protect each other. And then I think for me, it took a lot of soul searching. And this is where part of the self-resilience came in, was that understanding that while I had on paper a solution, I couldn't actually quite implement it until I was in that right space to do so. And yeah, after some self-reflecting, I found that the only thing I could do in uncertainty is control my own actions. And then once I came to that understanding and knew the only way that I could survive this time was to be useful, was to be productive, and to be kind. So it was at that point when we launched Barter for Better Fiji.
Thanks, Marlene. And perhaps if I can just get you to explain a little bit about what Barter for Better Fiji actually does and how it works.
Sure. So it's basically is an online platform. It's a Facebook page or group that allows members from right across the country to be able to trade with each other. So what they have in their homes, what they can grow, what they can produce, what they can catch or harvest, and be able to use those items to then trade for things that they do need. Again, in a time where money was becoming scarce, where people were watching what they were spending and needed to keep cash for things like rent, for bill payments and everything. This offered them a space to be able to trade, to save their cash for those purposes, and to be able to trade things that they had or for what they needed. So that in essence was the purpose of the group. In terms of the philosophy of the group, though, we decided that very early on that it was going to be a space of nurturing, of kindness, and of a positive community strengthening.
Great, thank you, Marlene. We'll come back to you just to sort of understand how the platform and the community has evolved a bit as well over the last year. But now we'll move to Reverend James Bhagwan, who's, as you heard, deeply involved in an initiative which is called Reweaving the Ecological Mat. And really that encourages us to think about development in a way that brings together the economical or the economical, but also the ecological and the ecumenical, so based on our faiths. Can you please, Reverend James, tell us a little bit more about the initiative and how it really centers Pacific Islander resilience?
Thanks, Samantha. Bulavinaka to everyone. You know, as we look at the framework for resilient development and the goals that they have around strengthened integrated adaptation and risk reduction to enhance resilience to climate change and disasters, low carbon development, strengthened disaster preparedness, response and recovery, these key goals All of them call for the encouragement of a spiritual, theological, and culturally inclusive approach to help achieve these goals. And this has been going on from the framework since 2017, for the last 4 years. It's interesting, though, that these are seen as priority actions, but also voluntary actions to be encouraged rather than to focus on. But these are the actions we rely on, as we heard from Marlene, and they are our practice in our communities, our teaching, as we heard from Kathy. And really, that is what the reweaving the ecological mat's core is. 20 years ago, at the dawn of this century, Pacific churches articulated what we call in this meeting Pacific resilience, but we articulated it as flourishing through the concept of the island of hope. And the 4 standards of resilience that we hear about today, integrate, include, inform, and sustain, were expressed from a perspective of community, respect, whole of life, and reciprocity. 10 years ago, these were again respoken by churches and civil society in the call to rethink Oceania, rethink development. Again, recalling our spiritual, theological, and cultural foundations of Pacific people. In this 3rd decade of the 21st century, I'd like to suggest it's not Pacific people who need nurturing from home. It's Pacific people who need to nurture their home. Our values that we proclaim as Pacific have almost become corrupted to just rhetoric. Our relationship with the land and the sea is becoming toxic. We take and we take from a fear of scarcity that has been imposed on us. And I say imposed because our culture, our true Pacific culture, indigenous culture, theological and spiritual culture, is one of abundance and reciprocity. Yet in times of crisis, whether they are natural or human-made, we get these glimpses, not just of resilience, but of our ability to flourish. Bartering, as we have heard this morning, going back to the land and the sea, weaving baskets instead of using plastic bags. And the question arises, can this be the way that we live beyond the crisis times? Can this original normal be our renewed normal? So not a new normal, but a renewed normal. So in this 3rd decade of the 21st century, churches, civil society, Pacific academics, conservationists, practitioners of traditional arts and culture are calling on our region to reweave the strands of the mat on which we sit, a mat which has become frayed, and removing the toxic strands and weaving in those strands that colonialism, neoliberalism, and all those isms have replaced. The strands of ecology, the strands of spirituality, the strands of caring and sharing. And really, replacing that. And the world today is calling for something that we draw on every day. And so, as you've said, we call it reweaving the ecological mat, changing our narrative on development for an ecological framework of development that takes into account indigenous knowledge, our indigenous philosophy, our indigenous spirituality and connectedness to the environment, our indigenous art and ways of sharing knowledge, biblical and theological knowledge, local knowledge, and Christian spirituality texts that focus us on our relationship with the environment. And it's seen as an alternative in many ways to the capitalist system or profit-centered or individualistic focus, because it's ecological and it's well-being centered, where the collective whole matters. But is it really an alternative paradigm when this is the way that our ancestors have done things in the past? That at the crux is the reweaving of the ecological mat. Thank you, Samantha.
Thank you, Reverend James. I'm sorry, I appear not to be able to turn on my video, but I am here. Thank you so much for that. I think there's some really powerful challenges in what you've talked about there for all of us. And just so that you know, there's some really great comments coming through on the chat function as well on the platform. So people really, this is all resonating with people very much so. So now, Kathy, if we can come back to you, I know that you also work in the policy space and as an advisor, and we're interested in what the Republic of Marshall Islands is doing with the National Adaptation Plan under your country's overarching climate strategy. You've mentioned before that thinking around adaptation responses is really evolving in the Marshall Islands, and I think that's probably true for many of us across the region, particularly in terms of balancing the need for timeliness and responding to the sort of global environment with the need to really ensure that action is locally determined and locally controlled, and that capacity is built, and also leverage the existing capacity. So I was hoping that you could talk to us a little bit about that process and what you're seeing through that. Apologies, Kathy, we can't hear you. Could you just check your mic?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we
Can you
can.
hear me now? Okay, great.
Thank you.
So, yeah, thank you. Through the Climate Change Directorate, we've been working with the national government, and there's a national mechanism that was set up called the Tili Committee, which basically brings together representatives from all the sectors on a quarterly basis to meet and to discuss kind of progress moving forward with the National Adaptation Plan. This past December, we submitted, we were planning on submitting our first National Adaptation Plan, but it's still taking some time to progress through it. And so what we submitted instead was an adaptation communication to the UNFCCC. And that was a pretty, rigorous process of bringing together what kinds of data we have already on island. And that relied a lot on data that comes from a framework called the REMA framework. And the REMA framework is a framework in which that's been utilized mostly by the Marine Resources Authority, MIMRA, and they go out to the different outer islands, to the different surrounding islands, and they work with on the village level, and they basically come up with their own ecological strategy for conservation and for conserving their island. And it's centered and developed by the community themselves, and so that it's not a national top-down approach. Rather, it's coming from the community about what their priorities are, what kinds of changes they've seen on their coastlines, what kind of changes they've seen to their vegetation, to their livelihoods. And that becomes their plan moving forward in trying to conserve their natural resources. So that data is our biggest source of data that is feeding into our National Adaptation Plan. However, it doesn't have everything on adaptation. And so there's kind of this place we are in as a country where, for many years, we focused a lot on mitigation, on getting countries around the world to lower their emissions. And we are still doing that. We're taking a really strong stance internationally on shipping taxes, for instance. We're introducing a carbon tax levy for the shipping industry, which is a big deal. But now we've decided to focus inward. I think Reverend Bhagwan just said something about Pacific people need to nurture their homes. We need to turn inwards. And I think that's, for me, what resilience really is about. It's about turning inwards. I feel as though there has been a significant shift for me on a personal level in turning inwards through the nonprofit and focusing on the young people in the community who are willing to work with me. But then there's also, a national shift towards looking inwards to look at our national structures, what exists and what kind of work we need to do to protect ourselves from the incoming tides, because we know that it's coming and we know that we don't have that much time left. The difficulty with that is, one, coordinating across a national process, very difficult. Not enough data at all. You know, I think that's kind of an issue that we reach across, or that, you know, exists across the entire region. It's just not enough statistics and not enough studies and data. And then there's a lot of science that are telling us different kinds of things. You know, we're working with you know, this global organization, the World Bank is funding, you know, the work that we're doing with the National Adaptation Plan. This is a difficult process that we're still learning to work with them as well, with these consultants. And then, you know, there's science telling us that there are more natural forms of adaptation that we should be exploring before we make the leap into hard adaptation solutions, such as figuring out which island we might have to move to, figuring out which island we might have to elevate. Those are extreme possibilities that we have to consider now. But what does that, you know, how do we answer those questions when it comes to traditional land tenure? What happens to if we move from one island to another, as we have done before because of the nuclear testing legacy? What does that, you know, how do we determine what happens to the landowners and to the cultural values that might be tied to that specific land? So, you know, we're learning, I think that the unique aspect of our national adaptation plan that really differentiates us from other countries is our nuclear legacy. You know, our nuclear legacy is going to play an important role in informing how we plan moving forward on climate change. The nuclear legacy, we've already lost, because of the nuclear legacy from the US nuclear testing, we've already lost islands, we've already lost land. You know, how does that experience tell us how we move forward in planning for climate change, you know? So I think that there's a lot of things that I could get into further, but I'll just stop there for now. I think it's all about kind of focusing inward and working through the government sector, and that coordination takes quite a lot of work and energy, and it's still something we're learning about and trying to perfect. It's not really there yet, yeah, but we're doing the best that we can.
Thank you, Kathy. No, thank you very much. And I think, as I said, you know, these are issues that many national governments and communities are grappling with, obviously respecting the particular legacy that you have there with the nuclear issues. Marlene, if we can come back to you, this is a question that's come up through the chat function as well, but we also wanted to just understand a little bit about how you've had to adapt and evolve over the last 12 months as the community's needs have changed, but also as the situation in Fiji has obviously changed with the second wave of COVID. So if you could just share with us, you know, briefly some of the things that you're doing differently and lessons you've learned. And also, you know, how have you maintained sustainability for yourself as well? Because it's a small group of people running Barter for Better Fiji, a group of friends who also have many other responsibilities. So we'd be really interested in hearing about that.
Yeah, thanks, Samantha. Sorry, I think my video has been stopped by somebody else, so I can't turn that back on. Right, there we go. Yeah, so obviously things have changed quite drastically since when we first started. Overall, how we moderate the group, what happens within the community space within the group themselves hasn't changed much. People are still, our members are still using it as a means to get what they need to survive, what they need to flourish and to grow. And they're still building that sense of community with each other, the connectedness that it has brought many people, especially now when we're told not to connect with each other and everything. So it has allowed for that space of positive giving, of caring, and of sharing resources amongst the members themselves. In terms of how the group uses and the members use the group, we haven't seen too much change except for in one area, whereas in the beginning where we had everything was being traded, a lot of luxury items, people used it for all sorts of means, whereas now you can really see it being put to its useful purpose. People are using it really as a means to get by. You can tell money is tighter. You can tell that the effects of sustained job losses that people are suffering more. And you see that coming through on one hand, and in terms of what they are asking for, what they are hoping to get for the things that they can provide and exchange. So that has changed a little bit, but in terms of how the membership uses the group, that hasn't changed much at all. It is in fact become more of a space of sharing and of caring and building that community. How we as moderators of the group have responded is that we really, like, this has been a learning curve for all of us. We didn't know what to expect right from the beginning. We didn't in any way probably envision the numbers that we would get on the page, where we have just under 200,000 members now. But what we have also recognized, that it is a space where we can also help with a response to the raging numbers of COVID in the country. So you will notice, like, within every post, that we put reminders of how to trade safely, what you cannot do, reminders to wear your mask, to distance, to not enter another person's house, to do your trades as quick as possible, and try and keep each other safe. So those reminders go out on every single trade there is. Just recently, we tried to help bartering data or top-ups for those showing proof of vaccination. So again, using the membership, using the platform to help drive some of the solutions that we've been told is the way out of our current situation. So I can say that the uses of the group have expanded, but the community itself, the community that use the page, the membership, which in essence drive everything. All we do is help moderate it, but they really drive how the page operates, and that hasn't changed too much. It has just grown from strength to strength to be a place of caring and of looking out and building a resilient community. In terms of sustainability, if you're talking about the group itself, that remains to be seen. I think for us, as long as there is a need for it, we will continue to volunteer our time and do what we can in the space. If things change, I mean, the beauty about bartering and the beauty about promoting it as a space of kindness and of caring for each other is easily taken offline. I would love to see it happening more often in neighborhoods, in communities, with your church groups, in your sports groups, in your neighborhoods, where you all can be growing, for example, different vegetables and sharing it amongst each other. Barter doesn't need to be organized. It can be done anywhere. It can be done across the Pacific, in any setting. So in terms of its sustainability, it should be around forever. And as Reverend mentioned earlier, the renewed normal, I would love to see it become part of that renewed normal. I would love to see the kindness that people show and the care that people show to their membership, to each other through the membership, to be replicated in real life, to be taken off the page, and to see that nurturing spirit come through in countries as a whole, or in our neighborhoods. I think that's in terms of sustainable practice, that's where it needs to go. It needs to be taken off as an organized and moderated group and allowed to flourish in our own individual spaces. I think I've covered that.
I think you have. Thank you, Marlene. I think that's terrific, and it's actually a really nice segue to the last question that I had for Reverend James, which was really about sustainability again. So you've written about Kairos, or this being the right time or God's time, and I was really interested in exploring how do we ensure that this time, where we've got time for reflection and we're learning so much, actually informs our collective action on the sort of fundamental climate threats and ecological threats that we face beyond, you know, this extraordinary period that we're living through.
Thanks, Samantha. timing is really important. In our region, this is most indigenous communities or communities that recognize and pay attention to what's happening in the environment. You know when the fruit is ripe to be picked. If we pick it too early, it is not yet mature, and if we leave it, it rots. And so, when we talk about Kairos time, we're saying this is the time. And particularly in this conversation this week about resilience, we really need to see partners and donors moving from the rhetoric of saying that we celebrate these values and we recognize them as being important to actually living and honoring it by practice. How do we see bartering valued and recognized, not only contributing to community resilience, but also being part of well-being? How do we see that as part of the GDP of a country with what is being done in the Marshall Islands with geographic and other places of indigenous knowledge? How is that being mainstreamed into our education at primary and secondary school? We need to pay attention to these questions. For the REM, the reweaving the ecological mat, it takes what we call 5 movements: looking at the mat, unweaving, adding strands, and reweaving, and also repositioning. So first we look at the situation today: COVID-19, economic and social crisis that comes with it, climate change, degradation, and exploitation of the land, the sea through extractive industries, overfishing, mining, deep sea mining. And then we unweave and look back to see when things started to change for the worse. Things that were the deals made generations ago with the lack of free, prior, and informed consent that started us on this path. And then we go further back to where the strands are good and the weave is still strong, and recall how we did things before them, when culture and spirituality guided our human interaction within this web of life, the ecosystem or creation. And then we begin to reweave, bringing in strands of revisiting and rethinking appropriate narratives, appropriate theologies, appropriate understandings of development from our Pacific. And we rethink and reset our development agendas, our trajectory, by weaving our own development paths. And the key to this is looking at well-being as the thing that we need to measure and value, rather than just the economic perspectives. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. Okay, so I think we have run out of time. I know that this could be a 3-day discussion in itself, and there are many really great questions and pieces of feedback on the platform. There's also a poll on the platform, so those of you that are listening in or participating online, please jump on there, because it's got some really great focus questions that will inform the discussion for the rest of this meeting. I'd like to just say a great big thank you to our 3 speakers today. You know, the 4 standards of resilience, which you'll see reflected throughout this week's program, are integrate, include, inform, and sustain. And obviously, while there's a great amount of complexity sitting under those standards, I think that in the case studies that we've heard today, we can see how some big ideas and some tangible community action can have practical benefits for our community. I appreciate, Reverend James, the challenge that you laid out for us at the end there as individual Pacific Islanders in our communities, in our organizations, and also for the donors and the partners and the regional organizations that we are interacting with, to really think about what development means for us, what resilience means for us, and make sure that it is locally driven and owned and led and uses our local capabilities. So with that, I'll finish up. Thank you so much again for your participation, and I really look forward to the rest of the program this week.